The warehouse smelled like sweat, chalk, and old ambition. It was the kind of place that didn't appear on any city map. Tucked behind a row of canneries on the Oakland waterfront, its corrugated iron walls absorbing decades of noise and secrets in equal measure. The year was 1967. The season was late summer, when the Bay Area air carried enough heat to make men irritable and enough salt wind to make them restless. Both conditions were present tonight. The crowd had been filtering in since sundown. They came through a side door, two at a time, paying cash to a man with a broken nose who wrote nothing down. Inside, folding chairs had been arranged in rough, concentric rings around a taped square on the concrete floor. No ropes, no corner stools, no referee in a white shirt. This was not that kind of event. There were perhaps 200 people by the time the evening began. Dock workers with thick forearms. A cluster of businessmen in loosened ties who'd heard about this through a friend of a friend and felt the pull of something they couldn't name. Young men trying to look older. Older men trying to remember when they were young. Women in the third row who watched with an attention the men mistook for admiration and was, in fact, assessment. The noise was dense. Not loud exactly, but layered. Multiple conversations, occasional laughter, the scraping of chair legs, the pop of beer caps. A haze of cigarette smoke drifted under the single industrial light suspended above the center of the floor. The light swayed, almost imperceptibly, in the draft from a gap in the roof. Shadows moved like slow water across every face in the room. In the far corner, separated from the crowd by 2 feet of empty space that people seemed instinctively unwilling to close, stood the man everyone had actually come to see. His name was Raymond Kowalski. The name meant little outside of a specific circuit that ran between San Francisco, Sacramento, and Seattle, a network of underground strength exhibitions, challenge bouts, and endurance contests that had no governing body and no written rules. Within that circuit, Raymond Kowalski meant something considerable. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed, by the accounting of those who'd stood near a scale with him, somewhere between 315 and 320 pounds. The weight was not soft. He'd spent 12 years on loading docks before discovering that men would pay to watch him lift, bend, and break things. Then they started paying to watch him fight. He had not lost. Not once in 31 recorded bouts. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest, wearing a sleeveless white shirt and canvas pants, and he was already sweating lightly, the way men his size sweat even at rest, the body's constant, expensive effort simply to maintain itself. His face was broad and flat, with pale eyes that moved around the room with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once walked into a room and felt he was the smaller thing in it. He had a habit of cracking his knuckles. Not nervously, ritually. 3 on the left hand, 3 on the right. The sound was audible from 10 feet away. Several people near him flinched involuntarily when he did it, and then looked away, pretending they hadn't. His manager, a wiry man named Doherty who wore a mustard-colored sport coat, moved through the crowd collecting side bets with a practiced ease, the money disappearing into a leather satchel without being counted. He didn't need to count it. People weren't betting against Raymond tonight. Nobody ever really bet against Raymond. There was a low stage at one end of the room where a man in a gray suit was speaking into a handheld microphone, running through the night's preliminary bouts with the rehearsed energy of a man who'd been doing this long enough to no longer feel anything about it. The crowd half listened. They were waiting for the main event. In the third row, slightly apart from the group he'd arrived with, a man sat quietly. He was not large. He was not loud. He wore a simple dark jacket, open at the collar. He was young, mid-20s, with a lean, compact build that would have registered as unremarkable to anyone passing a casual eye over the room. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, watching the preliminary bout with an expression that was not boredom, not excitement, but something rarer, complete, unhurried attention. A few people glanced at him. None looked twice. That was the first mistake of the evening. The preliminary bouts ended and the crowd exhaled collectively, the way crowds do when formality concludes and the real thing approaches. Doherty stepped to the center of the floor. He had a promoter's voice, made to carry in rooms like this, without amplification, without effort. He introduced Raymond Kowalski the way you introduce a force of nature, with adjectives that were technically accurate but emotionally insufficient. Undefeated. 31 fights. The Iron Coast champion. The strongest man west of Denver. Raymond walked to the center of the floor with his arms still crossed. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just stood there and let the applause land on him like something he was accustomed to and no longer needed to acknowledge. His pale eyes moved across the room once, slowly, and then came to rest on nothing in particular. The look of a man whose real attention had turned inward toward the mechanics of what was coming. Doherty made the invitation. It was phrased as an open challenge, a tradition in these events that the headliner would take on any willing opponent from the crowd, with a cash prize for anyone who could last 3 minutes and double the prize for anyone who could put Raymond down. The prize was $200. Double was $400. In 1967, $400 was 3 weeks of wages for most men in that room. No one moved. Doherty let the silence do its work for about 10 seconds, long enough for the embarrassment of an action to begin accumulating, and then smiled and started to build Raymond up further, speaking about a man he'd faced in Portland who'd lasted 45 seconds, speaking about the dock in Seattle where Raymond had. "I'll go." The voice came from the third row. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It had the same quality as everything else about the man who'd said it. The minimum force required to accomplish the purpose. But the room heard it clearly because the room had gone quiet at precisely the right moment. The man in the dark jacket stood up. He was, if anything, even smaller standing than he had appeared sitting. 5'7", perhaps. 135, maybe 140 pounds. He had a lean jaw, sharp eyes behind dark-framed glasses that he now removed and folded into his breast pocket, and he moved toward the center of the floor with a walk that was unhurried but contained a precision, a small, definitive quality in each step that a few people in the room noticed without being able to say exactly what they were noticing. Most people in the room simply laughed. Not cruelly at first, more the way people laugh at the unexpected, a small release of disbelief that this slight young man had volunteered to stand in front of Raymond Kowalski. Doherty's smile widened, and he looked at Raymond, and Raymond looked at the man approaching him, and something happened in Raymond's expression that was not quite amusement and not quite dismissal. It was the specific look of a man recalibrating downward, reducing his estimate of the effort tonight would require. "Son," Doherty said, kindly enough, "you sure about this?" "Yes," the man said. Simple. No elaboration. Someone in the crowd shouted something about the young man needing a doctor. There was scattered laughter. A man in the fourth row, heavy-set, with a beer in his hand, called out that Raymond should be careful not to trip over him on the way down. More laughter. Raymond cracked his knuckles. Left hand. Right hand. He rolled his neck, and the sound was like distant gunshots. He looked at the young man the way a mountain looks at weather, with the complete indifference of something that has simply never been threatened by it. "What's your name?" Raymond asked. His voice was low and rough, the kind of voice that had been shaped by years of cold mornings and physical labor. "Bruce," the man said. Just that. Raymond nodded slowly, as if filing the information away somewhere he'd rarely need to access it. "All right, Bruce." He said the name like a period at the end of a sentence, like a door closing. Doherty explained the rules. 3 minutes, no biting, no eye gouging, everything else acceptable, and the crowd settled into a new configuration of attention. They weren't watching to see if Bruce would win. They were watching to see how quickly he would fall and whether the falling would be interesting. Bruce stood at his end of the taped square. He had removed his jacket. He handed it to a young woman in the front row. She took it reflexively, surprised, and turned back to face Raymond in a plain white shirt. His arms were at his sides. His shoulders were relaxed. His feet were slightly apart. His weight distributed with a quietness that a biomechanist might have recognized as remarkable and that most people in the room simply read as stillness. He breathed, slowly, deliberately, in, out. His eyes did not leave Raymond's face. Raymond was now moving his arms in slow, preparatory circles, loosening the shoulders, testing the range. He took up space the way large men do, naturally, unapologetically. He looked in that moment like something geological, something formed over a long time under great pressure. The man in the white shirt looked like a graduate student who'd wandered into the wrong building. The crowd believed what their eyes told them. They could be forgiven for that. But there was a man in the second row, an older Chinese gentleman who had come to the event with his grandson and had been quiet all evening, who looked at the young man, now standing alone in the taped square, and became very still. He watched the way Bruce stood, watched the breathing, watched the eyes, and he did not laugh. He leaned toward his grandson and said something quietly in Cantonese. His grandson looked up. "What did you say, grandfather?" The old man shook his head slowly. "I said, watch carefully. You will not see this again." The grandson did not understand. Not yet. The room changed. It doesn't happen the way people describe it afterward. Not a hush exactly, not a held breath. It happens gradually, like pressure building in a sealed space, until you realize at some unmarked moment that the noise level has dropped and the quality of attention in the room has sharpened from casual to absolute. This was that moment. Doherty stepped back. The two men stood across the taped square from each other, perhaps 15 feet of concrete floor between them. The industrial light above swayed once in the draft and then settled, throwing its flat, yellow illumination across both of them without preference or ceremony. The sounds that existed now were small and precise. The shift of someone's weight in a folding chair. The paper-thin creak of an iron wall contracting as the outside air cooled. A distant foghorn from the bay, 3 long miles away. And closer, very close, the dry, rhythmic sound of breathing. Two men, two very different rhythms. Raymond's breath was the breath of a large engine idling. Deep, steady, audible. The breath of a body doing significant work simply by existing. He stood with his knees bent slightly, his hands loose at his sides now, his eyes fixed on the smaller man across from him with a focus that was purely mechanical, the assessment of angles and timing, nothing personal. Bruce's breath was something else. It was the breath of a man who had, through some discipline that was invisible to the room and available only to himself, arrived at a state that existed below tension, below anticipation. The chest rose and fell so slightly it was nearly undetectable. The abdomen moved. The jaw was relaxed. The shoulders sat level. It was the breathing of deep water, undisturbed on the surface, powerful in its depths. He had not moved since taking his position. His feet were planted at shoulder width, his left foot forward, his weight back and low, without appearing to crouch. There was nothing theatrical in the stance, no performance of readiness. It looked to most observers simply like standing, but it was not standing. It was the physical sentence before the verb, complete in itself, but pointing forward. His eyes had not left Raymond's center. Not the eyes, not the hands, the chest, the torso, the place where movement originates before it becomes visible anywhere else. Raymond advanced one step, a test. Bruce did not move. Someone in the crowd exhaled audibly, the exhale of a person who has been holding breath without realizing it and releases it suddenly at the small shock of that single step. Raymond stopped. Read the stillness in front of him. His pale eyes narrowed fractionally. This was not the stillness of fear. He knew the stillness of fear. He had created it in 31 men. This was something different. He took another step. Slower. Deliberate. Bruce shifted his weight, barely, just a few degrees, a micro-adjustment that redistributed his center without moving his feet, and his hands came up. Not high, Not dramatic, just present. The right hand, rear, slightly closed. The left hand, forward, fingers extended and relaxed in a way that was almost contemptuous in its openness, as though the hand were not a weapon, but a question being asked. Raymond stopped again. The knuckles cracked. Once. Left hand. It was habit. But in this new silence, it sounded like a declaration. Bruce blinked. That was all. No flinch. No repositioning. The eyes remained fixed, and the body remained arranged in its quiet, hydraulic readiness. And in the single second of that blink, some essential truth about the encounter was briefly visible, and then gone, covered again by the stillness. 3 people in that room would later claim they understood in that moment what was about to happen. They would likely be lying, but it is possible that something about the quality of Bruce's absolute stillness, against the backdrop of Raymond's considerable and impressive presence, carried within it the suggestion of an imbalance that did not favor the larger man. The light swayed once more. A woman in the front row crossed her arms. The old man in the second row had become so still that his grandson looked over at him, briefly concerned, and then followed the old man's gaze back to the center of the room. Doherty raised his hand. The room, all 200 people in it, held everything it had: breath, judgment, noise, movement. Doherty's hand came down. Raymond moved first. Of course he moved first. He had always moved first. 31 times he had moved first, and 31 times the man across from him had been unable to do anything productive with the information that Raymond Kowalski was now in motion. He came forward with the controlled aggression of a man who understood mass as a weapon. Not rushing, but accelerating, building momentum the way a boulder builds momentum on a slope, each step heavier and faster than the last, his right hand drawing back, his shoulder rotating into what would have been, in any of the 31 previous encounters, a finishing strike before the fight had properly begun. Bruce was no longer there. Not backward, not sideways, in any obvious direction. Gone. The right hand completed its arc through empty air, and Raymond's momentum carried him half a step further than he'd intended. And in the fraction of a second that his weight was committed and his balance was fractionally compromised, something hit him on the left side. Not in the way that things had hit Raymond Kowalski before. The impact was small. The location was precise. The nerve cluster between the shoulder and the neck, a cluster that the body uses to route signals from the arm to the brain. The strike was not a punch in the conventional understanding of the word. It was a targeting of specific circuitry, brief, surgical, delivered at a velocity that the human eye processes only as the aftermath, a sharp pain that arrived before Raymond could identify its source. His left arm went momentarily numb. He turned. Bruce was standing 3 feet to his left. The same posture, the same hands, the same face. The crowd went silent. Raymond stared at him. Something moved across his face, something he would not have permitted to move there if he'd had time to stop it. Something that was not quite recognition and not quite alarm, but lived in the territory between them. He reset. Crack. Knuckles. Right hand. Deliberate this time. Finding the ritual. He came again. Faster. Less telegraphed. Raymond was not stupid. 31 fights had given him a real education in the adjustment of technique, and he abandoned the committed right hand and came now with a lateral movement, trying to cut off angles, try to corner the smaller man against the edge of the taped square. Bruce moved inside. Inside was the wrong place to be against a man Raymond's size. Every fighter in the room knew that. You stayed on the outside. You used distance. You made the big man reach. Everyone knew this. Moving inside was surrender. Moving inside was inviting the clinch, the grapple, the smothering weight. Bruce moved inside. He was there for less than a second. In that second, a strike to the solar plexus, short and compact, no wind-up, generated entirely from rotation at the hip, the kind of force that engineers call transfer efficiency, where the moving mass of the whole body converts into the impact of a very small surface area. Raymond's body registered it, as something that had no business originating from 140 pounds. The air left him. Not all of it. Enough. He stepped back involuntarily. Just one step, but in 31 fights, Raymond Kowalski had never stepped back involuntarily, and his hand dropped 2 inches as his diaphragm tried to answer a sudden, insistent question about oxygen. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, in disbelief. A collective vocalization that was neither happy nor unhappy, that was simply the sound of 200 people encountering something that contradicted their established model of how the world worked. Raymond surged. It was a controlled rage, not blind, not thoughtless, but hot. He drove forward with both hands moving, combinations, covering angles, the kind of offensive pressure that turns space into a problem. The crowd leaned in. This was Raymond being serious. This was what he looked like when he stopped playing. Bruce retreated for exactly 2 steps. Then he stopped retreating. Snap! A lead hand strike to Raymond's chin. Not the knockout point, not the temple, the chin, a specific targeting choice. The chin redirects the skull backward. The skull's backward movement pulls the neck. The next movement disturbs the vestibular system, the inner machinery of balance. Raymond's head snapped back 2 inches. His footwork, mid-surge, became unreliable for the duration of a single step. That step was all. Bruce was past his guard. The strike that followed was not the loudest thing that happened. It was not the most visually dramatic. It was in the memory of every person in that room who later tried to describe it. The most certain thing, a short, horizontal right hand, driven from the hip, landing on Raymond's floating rib with the entire torquing force of Bruce's body weight behind it. The sound was different from a body blow. Crack. Dry. Clean. Final. Intentional supplication, his head bowed, his body answering its own surprised and urgent communications. He did not get up. Not immediately. Not within the 3-second count that Doherty began in a voice stripped entirely of its promotional quality, replaced by something raw and involuntary. Not within 10. He stayed down. The silence that replaced the crowd noise was not ordinary silence. It was the silence of a room full of people simultaneously revising something fundamental, an assumption, a belief, a certainty that they had held without examining it. That size was the primary language of physical dominance. The light above the floor swung once in the draft. Raymond Kowalski's hands were flat on the concrete. The young man in the white shirt stood 3 feet away and was looking at no one. The silence lasted longer than silences usually last. It stretched past the point of ordinary disbelief and into something closer to ceremony. The room processing an event that had no available category to sort itself into. People looked at each other, found no useful information in the faces they found, looked back at the center of the floor. Raymond was moving now, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man taking a full inventory of his body before committing to an action. He rolled from his hands to one knee, stayed there. His breathing had changed, shallower now, the rib making each full breath expensive. His pale eyes were focused on the concrete 2 feet in front of him. He did not look at Bruce. Not yet. A man near the back of the room said something to the person beside him, in a voice that was meant to be private, but carried in the new silence with the clarity of a struck bell. What just happened? Nobody answered him. Doherty stood in the middle of the floor with his leather satchel and his mustard jacket, and an expression on his face that was, for perhaps the first time in a long career of witnessing things, completely unmanaged. The promoter's mask, the engineered neutrality he deployed in all circumstances, had slipped entirely. He was staring at Bruce with the open, uncomplicated expression of a man who had seen something he could not account for. In the front row, the young woman who had been handed Bruce's jacket was holding it with both hands, pressed against her chest, looking at the floor where Raymond knelt. In the second row, the old man had not moved. His grandson was looking at him now, waiting, needing the elder to make sense of what had just been witnessed. The old man's expression was not surprised. It was something more complicated, a quiet recognition, layered with something that might have been grief or awe, or the particular emotion that arrives when you're watching history be made and you understand it is history while it's still happening. Bruce picked up the jacket from the woman in the front row. He did it without ceremony, the simple recovery of an object set down. He held it over one arm. He looked at Doherty briefly, the look transferring a single piece of information. "We're done here." Then he turned. Raymond's voice came from behind him. Low, not angry. Something more difficult to define. "Ow," Raymond said. It was not quite a question. It was the beginning of a sentence that he apparently couldn't locate the rest of. Bruce stopped. He did not turn immediately. He stood with his back to Raymond for a moment, 2 seconds, perhaps 3, and in those seconds the room held everything again, all 200 people suspended in the understanding that something was being decided, some choice made about what would be said or not said, about how this moment would be sealed. He turned halfway, just the upper body, enough to be heard clearly. "You were fighting a size you assumed I had," Bruce said. Quiet. No performance in it. The sentence landed with the weight of something that had been considered long before this evening and was offered now not as a lesson, but simply as the accurate description of what had occurred. Raymond stared at him. His mouth opened slightly. Closed. Bruce turned back toward the door. Someone in the crowd tried to start something, applause, perhaps, or a question, and the attempt failed, the single sound absorbed immediately by the quality of the room, which was not ready to return to ordinary noise. The event had not yet finished processing itself. At the door, Bruce paused. He put on his jacket with the unhurried precision of a man resuming an interrupted evening. Collar adjusted, buttons attended to in the correct sequence, the small rituals of appearance carried out without vanity, simply as the completion of form. He had not looked back. The door opened. The salt air from the bay entered briefly. The door closed, and Raymond Kowalski, 31-time undefeated champion of an unnamed circuit between San Francisco and Seattle, was still on one knee on a concrete floor, breathing carefully, trying to understand what he'd been fighting. The light above swayed. The cash in Doherty's leather satchel did not change the amount of what had happened. The story moved the way true stories move, imprecisely and therefore indelibly. It did not move through newspapers. There were no photographs, no official accounts, no documentation of any kind. The people who had been there carried it in their own ways, in the particular idiom of their own understanding, and released it into conversations over the following weeks and months in fragments. The way you describe a dream that felt important, with the awareness that the telling is already a diminishment. The dock workers talked about the speed. That was what stayed with them. The fact that Raymond had been mid-movement and the small man had simply been elsewhere, and then been somewhere else again, and the whole encounter had taken place in a geography of position and timing that the dock workers felt in their bodies without being able to map it in language. The businessmen in the loosened ties talked about it differently. They talked about the stillness before. They had sat in boardrooms and watched negotiations, had watched men perform confidence and aggression as instruments of leverage, and they recognized, sitting in those chairs in the weeks afterward, turning the memory over, that the stillness they'd witnessed was the same instrument at a different magnitude. They couldn't explain it to their wives. They tried. Doherty told people the small man's first name was Bruce. That was all he had. He didn't know. None of them knew. Not that night, that the young man who had walked quietly into an Oakland warehouse and handed his jacket to a woman in the front row had spent his adolescence in Hong Kong studying Wing Chun under a man named IP Man. That he had crossed an ocean and built a school in Seattle. That he was developing a system of combat that would eventually be codified under the name Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist, a philosophy of fighting that held, as one of its central tenets, that the highest technique was the abandonment of technique in favor of pure, responsive truth. They didn't know his last name was Lee, but the story lived without his name. It was told in gyms, in bars near the waterfront, in the parking lots after other events where other large men prepared to demonstrate the argument of their size. It became a story told to young men who were too small for the sports that interested them, told by older men who had sat in those folding chairs and understood that something in their settled view of power had been permanently rearranged. It was told specifically and with great regularity by a man who had been standing near the back of the room when it happened, a former amateur boxer named Curtis who ran a small gym in East Oakland and whose coaching philosophy changed, noticeably and permanently, after that August night. Curtis told his students, "Strength is not negotiable. Train for it. But speed that cannot be tracked cannot be defended against. And a man who is perfectly still before he moves gives away nothing." He told them this for 30 years. He never mentioned Bruce Lee by name because he didn't know it, and names seemed beside the point in any case. The point was the thing itself. The 15 feet of taped floor, the silence before, the silence after, and the understanding that the categories by which we measure threat and capability are not discovered but constructed and can be unmade in a moment by someone who operates outside them. The old man in the second row, the one who had leaned to his grandson with a quiet instruction to watch carefully, returned to that waterfront neighborhood many times in the years that followed, though the warehouse was eventually torn down and replaced with a storage facility. He told his grandson, when the grandson was older and asked, that he had recognized the young man from a description given to him years earlier by someone who had watched him train in Hong Kong. "Did you know what would happen?" the grandson asked. The old man thought about it seriously, as he thought about most things. "I knew," he said finally, "that what I was watching was rare. Not the fighting, the quality inside the fighting." He paused. "Rarity is recognizable if you know where to look." The grandson asked where to look. The old man smiled. It was small, precise. "At what is still," he said, "when everything else is moving." In the years that followed, Bruce Lee would become many things to many people. He would become a film star and a cultural icon and a symbol and a legend, and eventually a myth, the particular kind of myth that forms around a true story because the truth itself is somehow not quite large enough to contain what it means. But the men and women who sat in folding chairs in an Oakland warehouse in the summer of 1967 knew something that the myth could not fully convey, that the legend had a texture, that it had the specific sound of shoes on concrete and the specific silence of 200 people revising their understanding of physics and the specific, unremarkable quality of a young man putting on his jacket at the door. He had not celebrated. He had not lingered. He had adjusted his collar and walked out into the salt air and left the room to its silence, as though the whole event had been, for him, simply a demonstration of a principle he already knew. And perhaps it was. Perhaps this is the truest thing that can be said about genuine mastery, that it does not require witness, that it does not grow or diminish based on who is watching, that the man who has truly understood something moves in the same way whether the room is full or empty, not performing the skill, but simply being the skill, the way water is wet without deciding to be. Speed is invisible until it has already arrived. Silence is not the absence of power. It is what power looks like when it has nothing left to prove. He walked out into the night. The bay was dark and wide. The foghorn called once from somewhere far out on the water. He didn't look back. He never looked back.